Please join me in welcoming first Dr. Dominick Hernández.
Thank you. What a privilege and honor it is to be here with you all this evening. Thanks to those that organized this event. And I'm just grateful. I'm grateful to be here with you all. A Puerto Rican, a theologian, a few Israelis, and a couple of Jewish believers in Jesus all step onto a college campus. Now, it sounds like the beginning of a terrible dad joke. I'm the father of a teenager, and by way of this, I am an expert at bad dad jokes. But the reason why this Puerto Rican, the theologian Dr. McDermott, our Israeli friends, Shalom Buenos and Noam Oveni, and all of you are here is no laughing matter. Anti-Semitism is no laughing matter. In fact, the unity in diversity that is represented in this room, on this stage and in this room, communicates that anti-Semitism is not simply a problem for Jews to deal with. Given that anti-Semitism is an expression of racism, and racism by its nature weakens the fabric of any society, anti-Semitism is a problem of every single person who desires to live in any decent community. Anti-Semitism has time and again reared its ugly head ever since the designation Jew became a word. This has been particularly the case on college campuses since last year's horrific terrorist attack upon Israelis and the ensuing search for the Israeli hostages. There are indeed aspects of military conflicts that are extremely complex, and we all, therefore, must admit our partial ignorance to all of the facts. But on the other hand, there is an uncomplicated and ancient underlying theme to many of the demonstrations in this present age: the hatred of Jewish people for being Jewish people. Contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism are frequently reconfigurations of similar tactics that have been used in the past. And so in this talk, we'll briefly travel into the ancient past and make three observations present in the book of Esther that illuminate aspects of contemporary anti-Semitism. As a Christian person, my hope is to encourage other Christian people to empathize with the plight of Jewish communities throughout the ages and encourage dialogue between Christians and Jewish people concerning this unfortunate but perpetual cycle of anti-Semitism. Now, the book of Esther depicts the story of the Jewish protagonist Esther and her older cousin Mordecai in Persia at some point in the 5th century before Christ, during the reign of King Ahasuerus. The details of how the story begins and how the story ends are relatively well known to anyone who may have heard this story in their church, have heard it in their synagogue, or have ever celebrated Purim. The story begins as a domestic dispute. King Ahasuerus divorces his wife, Vashti, and ultimately marries Esther. Esther subsequently reveals that she is a Jewish person after there is a plot to annihilate the Jews, after this plot is approved by her husband, the king, at the urging of the viceroy, Haman. Queen Esther reveals to her husband, King Ahasuerus, that her life is at risk because she is a Jewish person as well. The king has Haman hung and permits the Jewish people to defend themselves over 2 days. And those 2 days inaugurated a feast called Purim, which is a holiday that's celebrated into modern times. Many of us are familiar with this outline, but now let's readjust our lens and let's look at the story through a lens through which we can look at the book and make observations related to anti-Semitism that are pertinent to the modern Jewish community. A couple of observations from the book of Esther offer prototypes that facilitate understanding and denouncing the issue of anti-Semitism in our day and age. The initial observation relates to the concealing of the Jewish identity. King Ahasuerus, in the story of Esther, King Ahasuerus' servants, as they assemble the young women of the city of Susa early in the story, the narrator interjects in chapter 2 to describe a lovely Jewish woman named Hadassah, who also goes by Esther, whose family originates from Jerusalem. Esther was being raised by her cousin Mordecai. Just a couple of verses later, we read that Hadassah didn't reveal her identity as a Jewish person, and later on in the narrative, we read why. Hadassah's cousin Mordecai told her not to tell anyone that she was a Jew. Now, this information about Esther and Mordecai being Jewish people comes into play later in the narrative. It's foreshadowing. These subtle comments portray a situation that many non-Jewish people simply might not consider paying attention to, and that's the following. Jewish people concealing their identity as Jews because of potential anti-Semitic repercussions. Let's take a look at the reality presented in the book of Esther. The Jews are an ethnic minority outside of their homeland, just like about a little bit less than 50% of the world's Jewish population today. Some Jews who are ethnic minorities outside of Israel alter their behavior or conceal signs of being Jews. Now, maybe this is the real reason, or the reason, or at least one of the reasons why Hadassah, a Hebrew name which means myrtle, is referred to as Esther, a name related to the ancient Near Eastern goddess Ishtar. And granted that Mordecai was a historical figure, who knows what Mordecai's Jewish name may have been? The name that we have in Esther is related to the ancient Near Eastern god Marduk. Environmental factors that force Jewish people to hide the fact that they are Jews, whether it be at work, on college campuses, or in any residential community, for the sake of their safety, are intolerable. These are areas in which anti-Semitic behavior is at least being tolerated, if not propagated. And this was certainly the case in Persia in the 5th century before Christ, and unfortunately continues to be the predicament of Jews today. Let us commit to creating environments in which Jews are comfortable with who they are and are never forced to conceal the fact that they are Jews. The second observation from Esther relates to the collective contempt for Jews that appears in the book. At the beginning of Esther chapter 3, the narrator introduces a new character, Haman. I've been expecting to get a few boos here. Now, for reasons not explicitly stated in the narrative, the king's servants bowed down to Haman. However, Mordecai doesn't bow down. And when he's pressured about this, he reveals that he's a Jew, and thereby he does what he told his cousin Esther not to do. Now, the way the story's set up, it's reasonable to suggest that Mordecai's admission that he is a Jew is connected to his refusal to bow down to Haman, perhaps invoking a couple traditions related to the Torah of not bowing down to anyone but the Lord God of Israel. Irrespective of whether this is the case or not, it's out there. Mordecai is a Jew. Now, we should pay very close attention to Haman's reaction. He doesn't just punish Mordecai for his personal action. He doesn't just plan to put Mordecai to death, as harsh of a punishment as that would have been. He plans to kill the Jews, the people of Mordecai. And we're not done here. He doesn't just plan to kill the Jews of Susa, or in Persia for that matter. Haman plans to kill all of the Jews in the 127 provinces of King Ahasuerus. What an unreasonable response to all Jews is being depicted here. Haman rages at the Jews. He bears a collective contempt of all Jews because of his bad interaction with one. Just think for a second about the unreasonable reactions and stereotypes that are made about Jews because of interactions with just a few of them. Comments like, all Jews are rich, or all Jews have a strong hold on the world's banks, economies, politics, medicine, are the beginning of maligning the Jewish people based upon maybe experience with just a few. These types of comments, these types of ideas, propagate exaggerated interactions with the entire Jewish community. These lead to comments like, all Jews are, fill in the blank with an unflattering comment. The more frequently you say that to yourself about a particular people group, all Jews are like X, unflattering comment, the more you will dislike the people group, the more you will seethe at the people group collectively, sometimes for no reason. When this type of anger is targeted at a particular community based upon their ethnicity, it's racism. And when it's targeted at Jews because they are Jews, it's anti-Semitism. One of the things that struck me most during my last trip to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, and I had never paid attention to this in my other times that I had been there, one of the things that struck me the most was how Jews were depicted by propaganda artists. Jews were depicted as with these really big noses, these exaggerated noses. and money bags in their hands, with gold coins coming out of the money bags. This is how people in positions of power manipulate entire people groups to negatively interact with another people group. It's done by generalizing based upon it, and then exaggerating the negative effects that this people group has on society. And this manipulation is especially easy if the people group is a minority group with no power or representation, as the Jews have been frequently throughout their history in the exile. This mockery has occurred in the past and has resulted in the merciless exploitation of the Jews in their positions of societal weakness. But this is nothing new. This is what Haman did by asking King Ahasuerus for permission to annihilate all of the Jews. When he said, there is a certain people scattered about your kingdom and separated among your people in the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are different from everybody else's laws. So it's not appropriate for the king to tolerate the entire people group. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued for their destruction. Let us commit to refrain from propagating lies or collective contempt upon people groups simply based on our experience of the few. This is for all people groups. This is particularly damaging when the people group affected is a minority group that lacks the appropriate structures to challenge these collective arguments, these collective judgments, as has been the case with the Jewish community that has lived outside of Israel. Concern for Jewish self-defense. The third observation from Esther relates to the concern for Jewish self-defense. As the story of Esther continues, Haman's wicked plot to annihilate the Jews is eventually revealed to King Ahasuerus by Queen Esther. And as the story would have it, King Ahasuerus gives the Jewish community in the kingdom the right to act in self-defense. This happens over 2 days in which the Jewish people kill tens of thousands of people in the kingdom of Ahasuerus while acting in self-defense. Now let me just pause here for a second and say that I, as a Christian, believe that all humans are created in God's image. I am deeply saddened when I read passages like this one, passages in the Old Testament that relate to war and death. I hate war. We all should hate war. There is a problem if anyone likes war. It is a colossal affair for one human to take the life of another human. Be that as it may, anti-Semitic events have caused Jewish people to respond in self-defense. That is to say, when others attack the Jewish community for being Jewish, Jewish people have been compelled to protect themselves. There is a unique outcry from the international community when the independent democratic Jewish state of Israel acts in self-defense. Now, I have to pause and nuance that statement as well, right? Not much you can nuance in 15 minutes, but professors live in the world of nuance. Criticism of Israeli policy is not anti-Semitism. While I was living in Israel, I realized that many of my Israeli friends were way more critical of Israel's government than many of my North American Christian friends. What is particularly troubling, however, is the lack of support for Israel's self-defense when it is clear that some attacks upon Israel stem from harboring hatred toward Jewish people because they're Jews. Given the historical nature of anti-Semitism, at least from the time of Esther, Jewish people have been under a perpetual threat of extinction. Those who claim that Jewish people do not have a right to self-defense communicate by deference that others have the right to attempt to annihilate them just as Haman desired to annihilate them. When the Jewish state defends itself, words like Jewish aggression or phrases like Jewish aggression are employed. And this is the type of rhetoric that can sometimes function to deny Jewish people the fundamental right that we give to all others, the right to self-defense. Now, these three observations from Esther, concealing one's Jewish identity, the collective contempt for Jews, and concern for Jewish self-defense, have painted a picture of the Jewish struggle for survival throughout the centuries up until this very day. Now, one of the most intriguing aspects of the book of Esther is the fact that neither the name nor the title of God appears in the Masoretic version of this text. This silence breeds different interpretations of the context of the book. Now keep that in mind, because by the time we get to Esther chapter 9, we read that there came days in which the Jews gained relief from their enemies. Those days were to be called Purim. And during the observation of Purim on an annual basis, the Jewish people continued to joyously celebrate relief from their enemies. For many Jewish people, Purim is a celebration of how strong the Jewish community has been throughout the centuries and how they have been a resilient people group. And I would say that this is certainly the case. But I would suggest that there might be something else hidden between the lines of divine silence. God's name and title may be absent from the text of the book, but God's presence certainly has not been absent in preserving the Jewish community to ultimately fulfill the promises that God gave long ago to their forefather Abraham. The most important of which is that he would be a blessing to all of the nations through his seed. Perhaps one of the reasons for divine silence in the book of Esther is to show the real-life circumstances of God working behind the scenes, preserving this people group to fulfill the divine purpose through them to bless all the nations. Christians believe that this ultimately came to pass through the advent of Jesus as Messiah and the unity that all can experience with one another and with God through him. For those who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, nothing less than the lineage of the chosen one of Israel was at stake in every act of anti-Semitism prior to Jesus' advent. And contemporary anti-Semitism can be, in fact, should be viewed as nothing less than an attack upon the Messiah's own people group. Our interpretations of divine silence in Esther and the reason for celebrating the meaning of Purim do not need to be identical in order to recognize that at the heart of the continued existence of the Jewish people stemming from the post-exilic period to the present has always been one that has had to be actively preserved. Now, this is a reality that Christian people must recognize, but simply cognitive assent is not sufficient. We must do all we can to continue to advocate for the Jewish story, to empathize with their historical and contemporary suffering. This is likewise a call to the Jewish community to permit us to enter into your story and to be part of the conversation. A Puerto Rican, a theologian, a couple of Israelis, and a few Jewish believers in Jesus walked onto the college campus this evening. This isn't a joke. It's no laughing matter. This isn't even a contemporary issue. This is an age-old issue that we can address through dialogue, one conversation at a time. Thank you.